much, Anke, for a generous introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. No. See, the danger when I'm given a microphone, in my very rich imaginary life, I'm an excellent singer. So, when I'm given a microphone like this, I am tempted to break into song, but I can't actually sing, which is sad. Okay, so I will start by as well as thanking Anke and Pablo and Sarah for organising a great conference. And it is great to see things like this in Limerick, and old friends and new friends. I would also like, as one of the few Irish people in the Department of Psychology in Limerick, to welcome you to Ireland, and Limerick in particular. Nadine said that Anke may not be aware that Limericks aren't actually from Limerick. But keep going with trying to make up your Limerick. It's a good effort. But for a true cultural experience, I'd like anybody who's able to or willing to come for a swim in the river this evening after the conference ends. Water temperatures are high for Ireland, as is the water level. Especially put the rain on so that you could all swim. And there's a very nice spot about 2.5 to 3k upriver from where we currently are, if anybody is interested. So I mean that seriously. Well done, Alex. Alex is a volunteer. So see, there are people who are willing. So do think about it. It'll be a bit of fun. And stop shaking your head, Magda. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about... Is this working now? No?
You know what? Either you're going to start singing or I don't know what. But it's not like loud enough, so let's see.
Yeah, I'm not loving that. Not loving that.
Hello? See, with me it's louder. Maybe you just have to do 2 hands like this.
Okay, is that any better? Okay, so maybe it's the mic. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about social identity model of traumatic identity change, and I'm going to try and convince you that trauma is an important part of understanding culture. And that without paying attention to trauma, we probably can't really get a grip with lots of things in social and cultural psychology. So I'd like to start by thanking all of these people. Like so many things, whether it's a Department of Psychology or a big grant, much of what happens is actually not to do with my work. It's to do with the work of other people. But of course, I come along and try and take as much credit as is humanly possible. But I would just like to point out, if there are any errors anywhere along the way, they are not mine. They will definitely be one of these losers here will be responsible for the errors. So just to let you know, that's how it kind of rolls. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is convince you that trauma matters. We had a pre-conference workshop the other day, and I was talking about how people had started to use the word trauma in a way that belittled what trauma was somewhat. So for instance, I'm sure Hazel, Anke's daughter, is conversant with the idea that secondary school students often say that they're traumatized because they were given too much homework. Or my children are routinely traumatized by the fact that I'm their mother. So these kinds of things are not what we mean by trauma. What we're talking about is really serious material change in people's circumstances as a consequence of major life events. And we know that trauma has a burden, and that in particular the burden of trauma is thought to be responsible for a lot of mental health costs, but also there is a physical health cost, because many people are, for instance, if you're in a car accident and you have a major injury, if you're assaulted and you have a brain injury, there's physical health costs to trauma too. But if we take just post-traumatic stress disorder on its own, it's estimated that it is responsible for as much disability as something like schizophrenia, which is seen as being the major chronic mental health complaint that causes a huge amount of economic burden in Western countries. Trauma can also contribute to poverty, disability, underemployment, so it is actually a marker of many other things and can bring many other problems in its wake. and it has significant social and economic costs. So it is way more than having a mother that is constantly making fun of you. Okay, so when you meet someone, and in fact Kevin and I just had this conversation where we talked about how we're not traumatized, but actually most people you meet every day are likely to have had an experience of trauma. It is remarkably common, even though we're disallowing minor events. And most people who have experienced trauma do not have psychopathology. So the real story here is how people manage to resolve their trauma, how they manage to work through it, or how they manage to be resilient. So that's the real story that we need to pay attention to. How are people progressing through really very difficult circumstances in life? And if we look at trauma, one of the things as a topic, one of the things that we see is that it's kind of, there's a split down the middle of how people understand it. On the one hand, there's kind of clinical psychology and social psychiatry, and they see trauma as being something that operates at the level of the individual. The idea that something extreme or difficult can cause an extreme reaction. And you will see in that literature people talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, and generally psychological and health problems as a consequence of trauma. You'll also see people talking about growing as a result of trauma. And when they talk about social relationships, it will be in the terms of talking about social support. So it'll be about how other people can help you. But it's still at the level of the individual and seeing how those relationships might matter. In social and cultural psychology, then, there's a slightly separate tradition where people talk about group-based experiences in trauma. So, for instance, you might get people talking about how Irish people have experienced trauma because of the Troubles or because of a colonial past. So you will see coming through the idea that all of the group is affected by trauma. You will also see talk of trauma resulting in actions against injustice, so the idea that the group will react, so that you will see people being more sympathetic to events that affect their in-group than their out-group, and that sometimes events that affect the in-group will result in overly angry responses to the out-group who are perceived as having caused the trauma. But in this tradition, you don't necessarily see people discriminating within the group and seeing that the personal experience for some group members is very different than for other group members. So the direct personal experience isn't necessarily accounted for. But what it does teach us is that we need this culturally sensitive support for people, which you don't get in the clinical psychology literature just as much, because they're orienting to social support as a generic thing for individuals. So considering all of that, why is it that I then come along and start telling you that we need a new model? Is that not models enough? Well, one of the things that the social identity model of trauma is trying to do is integrate these two perspectives, seeing that there's great things about both of these perspectives, but actually we need to pay attention to the two halves. And really the reason that the social identity model is important is because, number one, it takes account of the fact that trauma is actually socially patterned. There are very, very few random acts of violence, although we do like that phrase, and newspapers like that phrase. But actually, we can show quite clearly that trauma is socially patterned, which we'll come on to. We can show that trauma creates new groups, so people who are displaced from their home state because of war are often referred to by new labels such as refugee, which becomes a very important identity in terms of how they're subsequently treated. We know that witnessing trauma can be every bit as pathological as having the direct experience yourself, which tells you again there's something social going on. We know that there are particular types of traumas, those that are at the hands of another person rather than through some act of God or accidental, if you like. Although increasingly I think this becomes a problem when we start thinking about climate change, but trauma by human design seems to have a more severe effect. We know that our beliefs about the world, if they change as a consequence of trauma, has a much bigger effect on us. And we know that social relationships are really key to whether or not there's a lasting impact. And there's yards and years of research demonstrating all of these points. So really the need to involve and invoke the social and the cultural to understand trauma is there for anyone to see, should they wish to. And there's a health warning on this particular quote, but what you see in this quote is an interview with somebody who was sexually abused as a child, and in recounting some of this in a qualitative paper that we're currently working on, he actually says that what was more difficult for him when he was abused as a child was other people's responses and how he was dealt with in the aftermath of the abuse. It was that devastated him rather than the abuse itself. So very much placing social relationships at the heart of trauma. So when we think of classic clinical models of trauma, what you tend to see is people use this idea of trauma as a process. You have a risk, and if the event happens, you have to somehow integrate it, and that how you do at the integration will influence the outcome. So a very straightforward sort of model. The traumatic experience is the word used for the event. The available resources are things like your social relationships, whether or not you have money, perhaps where you live. And then your outcomes can be negative. You can go back to exactly how you were, resilience, or you can have growth. You can become a slightly different, and some people would argue, better person. So trauma, and again, we looked at some of this in the pre-conference workshop. So trauma, we know, is patterned. So here I'm using the example of my world in data to look at the effect, who is likely to be bereaved as a child, who's likely to lose their mother as a child. And you can see very heavily patterned differences to do with income of the nation. And of course, that's a huge trauma that gets to stay with you for many, many years if you lose your mother. And of course, is the reason why Walt Disney uses it endlessly as the basis of children's movies. The number of children's movies that begin with the death of the mother and then precedes the plot. Because of course, it's such a big traumatic experience, it is an excellent basis for proceeding with the plot. Walt Disney always, it always resolves. It's always an excellent outcome. So maybe Walt Disney, and probably does work hard on the building social relationships idea. But this one I also find interesting, which is the likelihood of having a child die as a parent. And I find this one really interesting because we have a name for children whose parents have died, but at least in English, we don't have a name for a parent whose child has died. But in many cultures, that name is there. And they tend to be the cultures where it is a more common thing. But in fact, I think that makes it means there's an identity resource missing for many people. They can't even label their difference. They can't label their loss. So in English, you don't even have a name for the experience that you have, which is if your child dies. And I think that's a very interesting, and in fact, something that we plan to study. So as well as those between country differences, you can see within country differences. This is work I did with Sarah, where we looked at the kinds of experiences people had in Nepal as a consequence of the earthquakes in 2015. What you find is lower status groups have more experiences of trauma. And that's true in many, many contexts. And in work we've done in Northern Ireland, it's not just quantity, it's also the nature of the experience. So the quality of the experience can be different, contingent on your group status. So boys tend to have slightly different experiences than girls. We see this in the Middle East as well. We tend to find ethnic group differences. There tends to be different types of traumatic experiences in regions affected by armed conflict, contingent on ethnicity. So this, and of course during COVID, we see these very clear differences in the types of experiences people have as a result of ethnicity, as a result of income group, and even as a result of gender. So that's the socially patterned part. Now I want to convince you of the social identity part. So a social identity model of trauma is an inherently social reconceptualization of trauma. So instead of viewing trauma as something that necessarily happens to me, it is something that happens to me because of some feature of me that is linked to my group membership. So for many people, this might be linked to gender. So for instance, if we take two of the major events that are likely, and the reason that men have higher rates of trauma than women, men are more likely to be victims of an aggressive assault, they're more likely to be injured during war. So the types of events that the traumatic events that men experience tend to be events that are to do with violent assault. Women, on the other hand, are far more likely to experience events that are to do with gender-based violence. So the type of assault is different. It tends to have a sexual nature. So there is immediately a qualitative distinction. But as a consequence of a culture of individualism that really drove the development of PTSD when it originally came into being in the DSM, we're not good at paying attention to that collective piece. So typically what happens in studies is that people control for gender, or they might control for ethnicity. But that doesn't account for the fact that what is happening and what is the experiences that men are feeling are enduring, or the experiences that women are enduring, are qualitatively distinct, and the risks that they feel, or the way that they feel they need to respond to those risks, are very different because of gender. So one of the things that we try and do in this work is we try and draw on this idea of collective processes, that we're engaging and enacting behavior on the basis of group-based features of life. So on the basis of maybe Irishness, or even whiteness, or gender, or being male or female, that we're drawing on these collective processes to understand our experiences. But because these features of who we are so unremarkable, we never ever think of these things as being relevant to trauma. We just think about ourselves as having had the experience without thinking about the basis of the experience being to do with our group memberships. Okay. So the social identity approach has three processes involved in it. One is that we categorize ourselves as a group member. So this is a very famous cover of National Geographic, picture of twins. And because of the way we understand groups, we probably look at these children, if we didn't see them on the cover of National Geographic, and would have assumed that they were not siblings and certainly not twins. Because we are inclined to categorize people on the basis of skin color. So first of all, we categorize. In the below picture, it is a picture of the line that exists between Palestine and Jerusalem. And this person going along in the cart may wish to identify however he may wish, but because he is on one particular side of the line, others will identify him as being Palestinian, no matter what he might say to people. So there are ways in which we categorize ourselves and ways in which other people categorize us. Then there's an identification process. Do we see ourselves as belonging to that group? So then do we take the categorization and own it? And very often people do, not always, but very often. And then there is a comparison process where often people are trying to maximize the contrast between and within groups. So to make themselves feel more like a group member, they want to maximize the difference between themselves and others. So Anka will sometimes say that she feels Irish to me. And after I stop laughing, I will say, okay, we'll allow Anka be Irish. She's been here 13 or 14 years. It's time now to stop policing her Irishness. She's here long enough. But no matter what I do, I seem to be incapable of of allowing Anke to be wholeheartedly Irish. And part of that is because there's some part of Anke that's not Irish, that is a second nationality, which of course is maximising the contrast. I can justify my exclusion of Anke as truly authentic Irish because she engages with something. And that's the idea of contrasting between and within groups, delivering a sense of whether or not someone is in or out of the group. So this social identity process is about not only whether I identify, but also how other people position me. And traumatic experiences can make identities really relevant. And this is a crucial part of the social identity approach, the idea that identities can become relevant. So Anke's Irishness is probably entirely irrelevant most of the time until I bring it up, or until something happens and it becomes apparent that she maybe can't speak Irish, unless you've learned it recently. No. So for most people it isn't relevant until it appears. And sometimes traumatic experiences really make identities relevant. And in this longer paper, one of the things that I argue is that when we look at something like gender-based violence in particular, what you find is that routinely for women, gender-based violence is made relevant. And I use this sign in the article to show how this woman who's supposed to be out running and decompressing and having a stress-free experience is actually unproblematically presented as someone that needs to be watching her surroundings at the same time and being cautious about the fact that she is running. So what is supposed to be a healthy activity is actually what you have superimposed here is the idea of risk, and that her gender identity is relevant to a potentially traumatic experience. But as well as that, traumatic experiences can create identities. So very easy to find representations of from places like, progressive places like the UNHCR, who will talk about the idea that people are refugees or migrants, and whether or not it's right or wrong to call people refugees or migrants or make that distinction. And of course, word choice does matter in this example, but the reality is both are new identities that are created. One is being created very much from a traumatic experience, and the second less so. But my point is that traumatic experiences are relevant to the content of these identities. So the social identity model of traumatic identity change has 4 hypotheses, although the 4th one isn't in this paper because we only thought about it afterwards. And Sarah and I were talking about it over lunch, and we think we have more data again, but yeah. So when the source is down there, just remember that the last one was an afterthought. Okay, so the social identity continuity hypothesis is the idea that if you hold on to your identities through a traumatic experience, you'll do better. So if, for instance, you are a refugee and you feel strongly about supporting Ukraine, you feel strongly that you have a Ukrainian identity, and when you move to your new country, you have access to other people who are Ukrainian, and you can continue to feel like you belong in the group, though you're far away from home. That continuity is likely to support you in having a better post-traumatic response. If you become disconnected from your identity, perhaps if you feel it's a low status identity in the new community, well then you're likely to have more trouble in terms of your mental health. The social identity gain hypothesis is the idea if you're getting new identity. So if you go to a new country as a refugee and you gain a new identity, perhaps as somebody who is a leader in a musical society, because there was a new musical society in town and they badly needed a singer and you got the slot, well then you are now a member of the Limerick Musical Society. That gain in identity should give you a bounce in terms of mental health. And the social identity revitalization hypothesis is the idea that new identities can actually reaffirm our sense of good in the world. So they can convince us that things are not, all is not lost and things are not as bad as they seem, and that revitalization can actually deliver outcomes such as post-traumatic growth. And the social identity empowerment hypothesis, we think, is likely to deliver not only growth, but also maybe things like an appetite for social change and social justice, so that people, because of the traumatic experience, find a sense of collective empowerment with others who have had similar experiences, and that galvanizes them and gets them to move forward. So they're the 4 hypotheses. How am I doing on time? Okay, so now what I try and do is the rest of the talk is just trying to give you examples of how this works and evidence of how this works. And there's something missing off that slide. Okay. So the social identity continuity hypothesis. The first study is a study that we conducted many moons ago now in Northern Ireland. And what we showed was that you were more likely to have PTSD as a consequence of the conflict in Northern Ireland if you had a weak social identity. So if you didn't align yourself to the divisions that existed in society. So not an entirely a good news story, because it suggests that you would have a more entrenched political position, but it certainly suggests that it would protect your mental health. And this is one of the paradoxes that the social identity model of traumatic identity change throws up. So in the second study, again, what you're seeing is where people see threat in Northern Ireland, where they see the risk of political violence being real. They rely on their social identities. The people with the most experience are those of the violence, are those relying on it most. And it's that group that are most protected by their identities. So it's again a conundrum. You know, you need the identity to survive the violence, and you do better if you have the identity, but of course then you end up with groups with high experience of violence who have quite entrenched identity positions. So there are political implications of that, not least that people are less willing to compromise. Much more recently, and as part of the ERC grant, we have been trying to show that this extends beyond psychological well-being. So in this study, what we're trying to show is that this effect of connectedness has implications for cardiac reactivity. So cardiac reactivity is how much physiological arousal you show in response to a stressor. So in this example, it's a banal stressor. It's a task that is effectively getting people to do mental arithmetic. Just adding another number, adding a number after that, and they have to keep it in their heads. And it is amazing how quickly people become stressed when you keep giving them mental arithmetic tasks. And we look at this in a group who have a history of childhood trauma, in particular high levels of the ACEs. And what we find is that this reactivity, which is indicative of things like mortality age 70, the reactivity is indicative of poor health, is less likely to be a problem where they have a strong sense of connectedness in their community. And this is a longitudinal study using what is called the Midlife in America, Midlife in the USA data series. So it's very strong evidence of a longitudinal effect of social connection with others in the community, managing or having therapeutic value, if you like, in terms of physical health. So moving to the social identity gain hypothesis, so this is the idea of taking new identities. This is a peculiarly Irish event, although I believe it has spread to the UK and the US. And it is an event called Darkness into Light, where people who are concerned about incidents of suicide in Ireland originally started up a fundraiser awareness training. No, awareness run, I think. It was kind of suicide awareness run, where people got out in the morning before dawn and ran or walked 5K that ended as the sun came up. So the metaphor being that the sun would rise again for particularly for people who had been bereaved by suicide or who felt suicidal themselves. So we were engaged with the non-governmental organisation who were running this Darkness into Light event. They're called Pieta House. And what we did was we got up very early in the morning, obviously, and then we went to Darkness into Light, and we convinced people to either be interviewed by us, or when they registered, we convinced them to fill in questionnaires. So they go on, say they're going to do the run, and then we say, oh, if you're going to do the run, will you please do our survey? Which they did do, and then we track them. So they do the survey, then they do the run, then they do the survey again. And we do have some qualitative material. But here I'm just showing you the quantitative. So what you see is the people with the darker line have had no exposure or haven't been bereaved by suicide, whereas the people with the red line have been bereaved by suicide. And what we show in the study is that there is a very serious improvement in positive effect for people who have been bereaved by suicide. I've registered for the run, and the other side of it, I've done the run. Now I'm saying run because we ran it, but many people walk this, and many people walk it with pictures of their loved one who has died by suicide. So it's very much about suicide, the event. And what we find is that in particular what's driving the improved mood, which is of course linked to psychological well-being also, is this sense of belonging that people felt from the crowd on the day. So, and in the qualitative interviews, what you get is people telling you that, and in fact, many people said things to us like, well, I've never told anybody before, but my father died by suicide. So there was a moment where people felt that they could share or they were connected with other people on the basis of this traumatic event that they had in their lives. So this study, when we published it, actually, one of the reviewers said, oh my goodness, it's almost like that is an intervention. Which of course we hadn't been thinking of it as an intervention, but that it allowed people a sense of connection or destigmatization maybe. So this is another different set of studies with people who have had brain injury, mostly men who have had brain injury as a result of common assault. And what we show again in this group is that the group who have good links to start with, so there is a kind of, you already have good social connections. Those good social connections give you social support, and that actually allows you to get more social connections, which is this active identity. So this is now moving to the sort of a rich gets richer model of identity, that because people had a good platform to begin with, actually they end up being able to have new active identities. And this, in this paper in particular, this is a group of people who are really quite disabled. So of course the only way they can have active engagement is with the support of others, at least to begin with. And in the qualitative analysis, you can see here that the person is talking about the way in which they lose identities as a consequence of brain injury, that people are very put off by the fact that they have become disabled, or maybe that their speech is poor, or that it's just very difficult to get past the stigma of the disability. So together, I think these studies show us that actually gain is really positive for health, and loss is really negative for health. Okay, so we're pushing through them now. We've only 2 left. Okay, so social identity revitalization is probably a more positive idea. And it's the idea that revitalization of a social identity can actually give rise to growth. So now we're moving away from the idea of resilience and actually suggesting that people can grow and become different and maybe happier as a consequence of trauma. And if this is a brain injured group again, and what we're looking at is the number of new groups that people have post-brain injury, and we find that this strengthened connection to the groups, together with the number of new groups, delivers people who have higher time to post-traumatic growth. And this last one is a group of women who have been affected by gender-based violence. And what you find is that where the women become activist in their orientation, that actually what you end up with, again, is more post-traumatic growth. But down here, as the driver in the X, if you like, so as the main predictor, is again this idea of multiple group membership as a platform. So having more than one or two groups is really important. It allows people to develop new groups, and allows people to appreciate what is offered by the social connections that they have. Okay, so the last hypothesis then is this idea of the social identity empowerment hypothesis. And of course, trauma is a fundamentally disempowering type of event. Most of us would say that we would define trauma as events that are unpredictable or uncontrollable. And what the social identity empowerment hypothesis would suggest is that if you can resurrect or indeed create a sense of agency after trauma, well then it is likely that you will do better. And in fact, that's what this paper shows. And again, with Sarah, we have tried in Nepal to go one step further. And actually, this is a good example of how being part of one group can lead you to membership of a second group. So the first group that I was a member of was the academic community in UL. I went into a partnership with somebody who was doing work in Nepal around political violence, because we wanted to look at the impact of political violence in Northern Ireland and Nepal. Then, as we were going to Nepal to start our first round of data collection, there was a big earthquake, and it felt like we would lose all sense of credibility if we landed into Nepal to ask about people's experience of political violence when they were sitting in rubble of houses. So we changed the study to be about the earthquake. That brought us, so that's one identity, one group, UL community giving rise to a change. But then, because we're now in Nepal trying to find money to help a school rebuild, we find this second group who, oddly, the Nepal Leprosy Trust in Ireland at the time was based out of Limerick. They then found us and said, but would you not play with us as well? So we end up getting very involved in work that the Leprosy Trust were doing. And in particular, they had this idea of self-help groups, and we had started to move to the idea that social identity could be a cure for trauma, if you like. And they had these participatory groups because leprosy is still very highly stigmatized, and a diagnosis is extremely traumatic for people in Nepal because they're often pushed out of their own communities. So this is a lovely slide. You should notice that the quality of this slide is far superior to the quality of the other slides because Sarah made this one, not me. And what we find in this and the idea of the empowerment approach is that the self-help groups allow people who were really disconnected because of the stigma of leprosy and the fact that they were excluded from communities. It allows people, all of whom have leprosy, to find connections with others. And through that feeling of connection and of identification in the self-help group, it allows them, there's an education program that allows them to become more involved in terms of social and civic engagement. And what you find is that these groups become much more psychologically healthy. They do better on all sorts of physical indicators of health. Health literacy is improved to the point that the group that starts off being the disadvantaged group in the heel of the hunt ended up becoming leaders in their communities around things like the correct use of water and how wells could become contaminated. And so a low status group effectively became a higher status group in these communities. So the conclusions, I suppose, and what I'd like to convince you of is that the social psychological foundations of trauma are major, and that the social identity approach offers us a way of moving beyond the social determinants of health. and that the clinical approach offers a way of thinking that moves beyond notions of collective trauma and allows us to connect the personal and the political in terms of the experience of trauma. So we actually gain, and that there are important implications in terms of politics, but also in terms of clinical treatments. So trauma is really a process that connects personal experience and political processes. And this happens because of the change in social identities associated with trauma. And not only that, that trauma is a major cultural force. It is actually culturally generative. There are very, very many identities. I would say nearly all of the major distal identities have elements that reflect features of trauma risk, whether it's national identity, ethnicity, race, or gender. So trauma is a culturally a force because it populates the content of how we understand these identities, and they are how we understand ourselves. Also think that a final important implication is that the trajectories of trauma, therefore, allow us to think about how trauma is really central to political and social change. So many of the groups that we are working with are non-governmental organisations that have actually arisen on the Irish landscape because of the personal traumatic experience of the founder, who then no longer wants this difficulty that they had navigating trauma to be something that other people face. Okay, that's it.